In our last lecture, we looked back at a time when the great goddess seems to have been more important than she perhaps has been ever since, both creatrix and culture bearer. This time, we want to take a look at a future development in her story, which coincides pretty much with the agricultural revolution and the change to domesticated plants and animals. Many of those early cave paintings feature prey animals, which seem to us anyway, although we're partly guessing at this, to be those prey animals are dependent on the fertility of the goddess, just as human fertility is. Once people settled down, the goddess's fertility roles shifted to the plants and animals that became the basis of village life. Initially, in the story that we're going to look at today, Inanna seems to have been associated with the storage of grain in warehouses, and Dumuzi with the growing power of the grain or the date palm. So the soil itself, as we move to the agricultural revolution, the soil itself becomes the body of the goddess, the womb that gives life. The great goddess becomes the great goddess of agriculture, just as in Greece, Gaia, the great mother, gives way eventually to Demeter, who's the goddess of cereal grains. The male role in agriculture becomes more precise as we move to the agricultural revolution as well. Mircea Eliade, in his patterns in comparative religion, says that there might have been a time in human history when humans didn't understand the relationship between sex and procreation. If that's the case, then it would have made women seem even more powerful in magic than they already were, because they were then able to produce both males and females out of themselves, by themselves, without any male help. He gives some examples to illustrate this. There are many early myths in which a child is placed in the womb by contact with some object or animal, a crocodile or a frog or a swan or a fish. And in other stories, there are stories where the souls of unborn children are placed in chasms or rocks or other sacred places where they are then ritually moved from those places into the womb of the mother. We've actually had an example of that kind of myth in Lecture 13 in the dream time for the Northern Australian Aborigines. Kuna Pipi, remember, part of her job in laying everything down at the beginning is to fill all of the magic places with the souls of unborn children, which will then be reclaimed or claimed by women coming by who wish to become pregnant and have children. I don't know if Eliade is right or not about this. There's no way, as I said, we can absolutely tell. But by the time we get to agriculture, the experience of animal husbandry would have taught people the male contribution to conception. So if the goddess is still the source of fertility and life, the soil in which things grow, the male by that time becomes sort of the phallic plow which turns up and fertilizes the female ground. The plow in those days was really not much more than a stick, so the phallic association would have been visually very precise. As Inanna puts it in one of her hymns, she says, she being the great goddess, she says, "Who will plow my vulva? Who will plow my high field? Who will plow my wet ground?" This myth and these myths coalesce finally into what is perhaps the most famous and widespread of all myths of all times, the vegetation myth, in which a goddess who embodies the fertility of the earth mates with a male who might well be her son. He has to be related to her in some way, since all life comes from the goddess in the first place. We remember, for example, Gaia generating Uranos and then mating with him, so in a way she's mating with her son as well. He provides the fertilizing seed, which the goddess then gestates into another year of plenty. But in this myth, there's another element, and that is the death of the male once he's done what he needs to do. In most myths, he dies and descends to the underworld. The goddess sometimes descends to try to rescue him. Sometimes he's resurrected by her, sometimes in a symbolic, not a literal way, so that either he or a new consort can repeat the fertilizing action. His descent corresponds to winter, when the goddess is bereaved and hence sterile. His return, however it happens, occurs in spring, when the cycle of procreation begins again. There are all kinds of ways of explaining this myth and explaining how it works and how it came to be the way it was. This is one that comes from a book by Anne Baring and Jules Cashford called The Myth of the Goddess. This one works for me as a kind of homology anyway, and as an explanation of why the myth took the shape it did. Let me try it out on you and see if it works for you. They say that they think this whole myth was based on the human understanding of the moon cycle. The moon seems eternal. It goes through the same cycles over and over and over again, but it goes through cycles of waning and waxing, of death and rebirth. These two aspects, they speculate, were personified as the whole, which became the Great Mother, and the part personified as her son lover. In the moon cycle, the goddess gives birth to her son as the new moon, marries him as the full moon, loses to him to darkness as the waning moon, and then rescues him in some ways as the returning crescent. The goddess is the eternal cycle, the life, the death, and rebirth as a single process, which then repeats itself over and over. The young male is her mortal form in time, subject to birth, growth, and death, and in some versions to rebirth. The Greeks had two words for these two concepts: Zoe, meaning infinite and eternal life, and bios, meaning a living and dying manifestation of the eternal in time. Zoe, Baring and Cashford say, is like a thread on which the individual bios is strung like a bead. In the agricultural myth, the goddess is the Zoe, her son lover, who emerges from her and then returns to her, is bios. She is the totality of the lunar cycle. He is the individual phases of the moon. So in this myth, the male is the living and dying aspect of the whole. And the whole, of course, is the matrix, the eternal. The moon might have suggested that death was necessary for renewed life, and the agricultural experience of planting seeds in a ground which then sprout into new life would have reinforced this vision of the necessity of death for new life. As Baring and Cashford put it as a sort of summary of what we've just been going over, if the Great Mother is identified with the cycle of the moon, which is permanent and unchanging, and the sun with the individual phases that wax and wane, then their disappearance could have been interpreted as a sacrifice back into the mother that allowed the cycle to begin again. To enact this myth literally would have meant killing and dismembering a sacred victim who personified the dying moon as an image of dying life, burying his parts in Mother Earth, and then waiting for new crops to appear, the same cycle that they go through each year. Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bough, which we've had occasion to mention several times already in this course, was written to explain the ritual that grew out of this myth, in which a consort of the goddess each year is either literally or ritually killed and then replaced by a younger male who can guarantee the fertilization of the goddess. As Fraser notes, the ritual was celebrated in spring in a ritual marriage. The king is either literally or ritually killed, and a new king takes his place, either literally a new one or the old king who's gone through a rejuvenation ritual. Then he mates with a priestess who stands in for the great goddess to ensure fertility for the new year. Our myths this time are from Mesopotamia, Sumeria to be precise, the oldest civilization in the region. We've already been to this part of the world several times in this course with the Enuma Elish and two flood stories from the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. Here we're going to be looking at two poems dedicated to the relationship between Inanna, the great goddess, and her consort Dumuzi. The first is called The Courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi, and it's a very polished literary work. It is also almost a pornographic literary work. At least it's very richly erotic, and it must have excited quite a few young people who had a chance to read it. The story begins, the poem begins, when Inanna's brother comes to her and asks her whether she doesn't think it's time that she got some new linens for her bed. What he's really suggesting is that isn't it time for her to be thinking about her marriage when she will need new linens for her bed. She says, she pretends not to know what he's talking about. She says she doesn't know anything about domestic tasks, and beside her linens are just fine. But he keeps at it until she finally says, all right, who do you have in mind? And he suggests Dumuzi. Dumuzi is a shepherd. She says if she's going to marry, she would prefer to marry a farmer rather than a shepherd. But he insists, and eventually Dumuzi is allowed to come and see Inanna and to see how this would work out. That contest, that contrast between the the shepherd and the farmer is one that we've had in other myths already in the past. The Cain and Abel story, for example, in the Old Testament, and the twins that the pregnant lady gave birth to after she fell out of heaven in the Huron myth. At any rate, when Dumuzi comes to visit Inanna, they initially disagree, but the disagreement, as sometimes happens, turns them both on, and she eventually agrees to the marriage. Then we get the wedding itself, which seems a reenactment of a Sumerian wedding ceremony. In it, the groom shows up at the bride's door with 3 groomsmen. In this case, Dumuzi brings a bird catcher, a farmer, and a fisherman, each bringing gifts. Dumuzi himself brings milk from his sheep. Inanna, meanwhile, anoints and decorates herself. When she's ready, she opens the door, which seems to have been the central moment in the Sumerian ceremony, and it probably has some sexual connotations as well. Torkild Jacobson, in a book called The Treasures of Darkness, which is a book about early Mesopotamian religion, says that in prehistoric times, Inanna was the goddess of the storage granary, while Dumuzi was the god of the date palm or grain, so that when at harvest, his produce was put into her granary. That marriage was reenacted. The power of fertility had been captured for another year. That myth also led the Sumerians and all later peoples in the area who followed them to a different kind of ceremony in which the new king would enter the holiest place at the very top of the city's ziggurat, the stepped pyramid dedicated to the goddess of each city, and there a priestess, anointed and decorated like Inanna, would receive him in reenactment of the marriage of grain and granary. As we noted back in Lecture 4, the Babylonians were still celebrating this festival in exactly this way 1,000 years and more later. The focus of this poem is on Inanna, not on Dumuzi. She is the source of fertility. She needs to be turned on and cultivated to be satisfied with him in order to assure another good year of crops. Dumuzi in this poem is himself more or less human. He's a representative of the community who has to perform certain tasks to bring Inanna to bestow her blessing. In the poem itself, Dumuzi, thanks to that blessing that he gets from her, is made king of Uruk. From then on, the king of Uruk was always considered an embodiment of Dumuzi, who, thanks to Inanna, rules over crowded sheepfolds and lush grain fields and forests full of deer and wild goats and orchards burdened with fruit. The blessing at the end of the poem says, "O my queen of heaven and earth, queen of all the universe, may he enjoy long days in the sweetness of your holy loins." The text is very explicit about the consummation of the marriage, and I will let you read that part yourself so this does not become an R-rated lecture. Dumuzi is very clear throughout, however, that his part is simply to stimulate her abundance. As he says, "O lady, your breast is your field. Inanna, your breast is your field. Your wide, wide field which pours out plants. Your wide field which pours out grain. Water flowing from on high for the Lord. Bread, bread from on high. Pour out for the commanded Lord. I will drink it from you." And she is likewise equally explicit about the fact that his own fertility is a gift from her. As she puts it, when she speaks to him, she says, "He has sprouted, he has burgeoned, he is lettuce planted by the water. My honey man sweetens me always. My eager, impetuous caresser of the navel, my caresser of the soft thighs, he is the one my womb loves best. His hand is honey, his foot is honey, he sweetens me always." Well, that's all the farther we're going to go with that particular passage, but you get the idea anyway. But she's the source of fertility, he is the ground, she's the ground that he plows in order to produce abundance for another year. This turns out not to be the whole story, however. There's a more famous poem about the two of them called The Descent of Inanna, which is about her descent to the underworld, her escape from it, and then her sending him back to take his place. She's the immortal one, he dies and rises again. To use Baring and Cashman's terms, she is always the Zoe, he is always the Bios. Spring is the time of the union of Inanna and Dumuzi, but spring is very short, followed by an intensely hot, dry summer when Dumuzi dies. It's never quite clear in this poem. We never quite understand why it is that Inanna decides to go to the underworld, but go to the underworld she does. And when she goes there, she has to pass through 7 gates. The underworld is controlled by a goddess named Ereshkigal, who also turns out to be Inanna's sister. Inanna has to pass through 7 gates on her way into the underworld, and at each one she's asked to lose some of her regalia. She loses her headdress at one, her earrings at another, her necklace at another, until finally when she gets to the 7th gate, passes through the 7th gate, she is stripped utterly naked and has to crouch before her sister Ereshkigal. Jacobson says that he thinks that this may be a reenactment of Sumerian burial ceremonies in which humans were presumably buried naked and in a crouching position, showing their deference, their obedience to death. In the underworld, Inanna actually does seem to die. She's actually taken and hung on a hook in the underworld like a slab of meat. But she has been smart enough to leave instructions behind her that if she isn't back in 3 days, someone should rescue her. It's finally her grandfather, Enki, the trickster, who, as Ea, we have met before, he's the one who saved humankind from the flood, who manages to do so. Ereshkigal is manipulated into freeing Inanna, but although she said her rules can be bent, they cannot be broken, and if Inanna gets freed, Inanna has to send someone back to take her place. And Ereshkigal sends a host of horrid demons with Inanna when she leaves to make sure that she actually does what she says she's going to do. Most people, when Inanna returns home, have missed her, so that she doesn't send any of them back. But Dumuzi is playing the king in grand fashion, seemingly unaware that, that Inanna is even missing. So she looks at him and she says, you're the one who's going back to take my place. The poem from here on spends a lot of time describing Dumuzi trying to escape from this host of dragons or demons, but eventually they corner him, they kill him, and they drag him off to the underworld. Dumuzi's mother is devastated, his sister Geshtinana is devastated, so is Inanna once she's had a chance to cool off just a little bit and realize what she's done. Eventually, a deal gets brokered with Ereshkigal. She's maneuvered once again into bending her rules. And in the final solution, Dumuzi spends half of each year in the underworld, and then his sister takes his place for the other 6 months. This turns out to be a really rich vegetation myth. It has a lot of parallels, as we can see, with the Greek Demeter and Persephone myth, in that the 6 months that Persephone spends in Hades is winter while her mother mourns, and the 6 months she spends with her mother are spring and summer when her mother is happy and produces crops again. Here, the time that Dumuzi spends with Inanna is the growing cycle. The time in the underworld is the year's sterile time. Dumuzi dies when the grain is harvested and he goes underground for storage. There may even be a tiny hint that Inanna herself dies, or almost dies, when the food supplies at the end of the year become dangerously low and all that's left in the storehouse is a slab of decaying meat, which is what Inanna herself was when she was in the underworld. That Enki should turn out to be her savior is absolutely right. We remember from Lecture 9, under his name there was Ea, his Semitic name, but he is the Lord of fresh waters, and it's the springtime inundation of the Tigris and Euphrates that generates all this new life, which turns the desert into green pastures and fields. The revival of the year implies the death of Dumuzi, since he's a shepherd, and the end of the growing season means the slaughter of his flocks so that meat can be stored for the coming winter. In a way, he dies with his sheep at the end of the cycle. And that cycle, like the eternal return of the moon, is repeated each year. Inanna comes close to dying herself as the storehouses are emptied, and her return coincides with that of Dumuzi, when the grains flourish, when the ewes give birth to lambs to produce the milk that was Dumuzi's gift to Inanna on their wedding day in the first place. There's one more really nice detail in the story. Geshtinana, Dumuzi's sister, was, again, Jacobson is the one who tells us this, was originally the embodiment of grapevines. Now, grapes are harvested at the end of the dry season, so Dumuzi returns from the underworld to help Inanna generate the season of grain and date palms and flocks, and then dies. Geshtinana returns to help generate the season of grapes, And when they're harvested, she dies, and it's Dumuzi's turn to come back again. The myth is also rich in all other kinds of meanings, including one of the favorite ways of reading them in the 20th and 21st centuries, and that is psychologically. We'll get our psychological tool out of Dodi's toolkit and see what we can do with that for the rest of this time. From this perspective, when Inanna travels to the underworld to confront her sister, she is really confronting her other half, the dark side of herself, because Ereshkigal is in fact her sister. In psychological terms, what Inanna does when she travels to the underworld is to confront her own unconscious, a step which, for Jungians especially, is really, really necessary in the process of maturation and individuation. In this way, she functions not just as a fertility goddess, which we've already talked about, but she also becomes a hero, taking that journey that many other heroes will take, and we'll talk about in our next unit. She returns more complete and self-aware than she was when she left, and all of this is made symbolically perfectly clear by the fact that when she comes back from the underworld, she brings a horde of demons back with her. Dumuzi, conversely, gets to spend half of each year with Inanna's darker half, and so he gets to experience the full range of the goddess's powers, from birth to maturity to death, which, like the spring grain, he emerges from the underground womb to restart the cycle all over again. The great goddess is remembered not only the womb from which all life comes, but is also the tomb to which it returns. And Dumuzi himself gets to experience that full cycle in the course of this story. The kind of psychological reading which insists that what Inanna is really doing is confronting her darker half, coming to terms with that darker unconscious side of herself, and we'll do more of that kind of reading in our next unit on heroes, makes sense to us Freudians and post-Freudians who understand the need to explore the mysteries of the unconscious, to be fully human, to be fully grown up. David Leeming and Jake Page, in their book Goddess Myths of the Female Divine, summarize this kind of psychological reading in this way. Inanna's descent into the earth to confront a sister who is part of herself is an appropriate metaphor or archetypal image for our own journeys into the darkness of the unconscious world. To be reborn psychologically or spiritually, we must often leave behind the trappings of older misunderstandings or protective masks, and in some sense to die to the old existence in order to be reborn into the new. Our subconscious, if not literal understanding of this process, is contained in rituals like baptism and works of literature like King Lear, where Lear must strip himself and confront the death of Cordelia before he can discover the whole king behind the mask of the misguided being who had divided himself as a kingdom into three parts. It is in light of these metaphors of our own culture that we can better understand Inanna's descent and the stripping away of her finery as she approaches death, the ultimate mystery of life. There's another psychological reading which is slightly different, which changes the emphasis slightly, which I think is really interesting and perhaps useful for us to consider at this moment in our course. This one, again, is indebted to Carl Jung. As far as Jung is concerned, the human being in growing up, in maturing, and achieving individuation has to conquer and master instinctual and unconscious patterns of behavior. We're born with these. We're born with a bag of instinctual habits and things that we do. And we also, because we grow up in communities, learn a lot of collective attitudes that unquestioningly repeat the beliefs of the past. And so that we have our own instincts, we're born with those, and then we acquire a lot of collective attitudes that we pick up from the culture in which we're raised. Inanna's journey to the underworld in this particular kind of reading symbolizes the need of the individual to separate him and her or herself from both those instinctual responses and from collective ones by challenging the tribal vision. The two of the gods that Inanna asked to rescue her if she isn't back in 3 days illustrate this commitment to collective attitudes, to tribal wisdom. Both of them turn down her maid when her maid comes to ask for help. They say they're afraid of Ereshkigal, and Inanna had no business going down there anyway, which is no doubt the prevailing idea. So in some ways, the underworld or the dragon or the monster that later heroes will have to face is really one's own fear, which has to be mastered in order to achieve individuation. Baring and Cashford say that in all myths, the hero's quest is a kind of symbolic drama of what is really an inner conflict. And it's valid in any age for men and women alike, whenever unconscious bondage to fear prevails, or whenever our dedication to received and collective habits becomes so strong that individuation becomes impossible. They quote Carl Jung on this issue, and this is what Jung says about this particular kind of reading. In myths, the hero is the one who conquers the dragon, not the one who is devoured by it. Also, he is no hero who never met the dragon or who, if he once saw it, declared afterwards that he saw nothing. Equally, only one who has risked the fight with the dragon and is not overcome by it wins the hoard, the treasure hard to attain. He alone has a genuine claim to self-confidence, for he has faced the dark ground of the self, of his self, and has thereby gained himself. This experience gives him faith and trust. The pistis, that's a word simply meaning assurance or trust, gives him the faith and trust, the pistis in the ability of the self to sustain him, for everything that menaced him from inside has been made his own. He has arrived at an inner certainty which makes him capable of self-reliance and attained what the alchemists called the unio mentalis, that is, the integrated personality, the mind which is now no longer fragmented against itself, but which now manages a full integration. So, what we've seen in this lecture is that as the goddess gives up some of her powers via the agricultural revolution, there is a new kind of union of goddess and human male consort that in itself isn't a bad thing. As long as they can maintain this partnership, it works out to the benefit of everyone. The union can be, as it is with Inanna and Dumuzi, a very productive and creative relationship. The same thing happens at about the same time in Greek mythology, where the idea that confronting the unconscious, mastering it without losing it, keeping contact with it at the same time, can produce a new kind of individuality, and it leads to a whole new crop of heroes at about this same time. As we know from our Greek mythology, there are a host of Greek heroes: Theseus, Jason, Hercules, Perseus, and Odysseus, all of whom managed to kill their monsters to get home after long adventures. But part of the wisdom of these myths is that none of them could have achieved these without help of females, either goddesses or women, whose union with the hero represents that perfectly balanced state in which the conscious and the unconscious, the intellectual, the intuitive, are in such perfect balance that great things can be achieved at the psychological level. Medea and Ariadne and Circe and Athena all symbolize the deeper levels of the psyche, the realm of the great goddess, and each one helps her male partner to overcome what for him is a purely intellectual grasp of a situation with her own deeper psychic awareness. Medea, we remember, helps Jason overcome the serpent that's wound around the tree that holds the golden fleece. Theseus needs Ariadne to escape from the labyrinth. Perseus kills Medusa with the help of Athena, and also with the help of that eye he gets from the three women, the Gracchi. And Odysseus is guided home by Athena after he has been seriously and significantly helped by Circe and Calypso. And so there is a way in which another different kind of psychological reading can help us understand that in a way, in Jungian terms, coming to this perfect balance between the two halves, between the conscious and the unconscious, can lead to the kind of heroism that Jung always talks about, that is the unio mentalis, that integrated personality. In earlier times, as in the Inanna Dumuzi myth, men held their thrones as sons and lovers of the goddess, and in their heroic quests they succeed only with the help of the goddess. In all of these ways, in this kind of psychological reading, the female personifies the older layers of consciousness that have to be sought out by the hero who can't get to where he's going without them. We're at a stage in the biography of the goddess where she's perhaps lost some ground since the Paleolithic and Neolithic days, but is still so important that nothing can be done without her. We'll get another look at this same moment in history the next time when we look at one of the most famous and long-lasting goddess myths in the entire world, that of Isis and her consort, Osiris.